Good evening, everybody. I'm afraid we are competing with election returns, but nothing could be as important as listening to Kate Anderson. Well, Kate is the senior researcher at Sightline Institute for the Farms and Forest program. She's working on rural lands and economies, particularly forests now. And she, before working for Sightline, up until a couple of years ago, she was a researcher and instructor in agroecology and environmental sociology and natural resource governance at University of California, Berkeley and University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has researched climate, biodiversity, water, and land use for the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research program, for the United Nations Development Program, and for the Brazilian government. Her most recent work has focused on supply management and associational democracy in the farm sector, including policy reform in the organic dairy sector and bringing fair pricing to the food system. Kate has a PhD in sociology, a PhD in environment and resources, and a master's degree in agricultural and applied economics. She also has hands-on experience in a farm and in lumber mills. So will you help me welcome Kate Anderson?
Thank you, Jean, for your warm welcome. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Jean, for your support of Sightline over the past 30 years. I'm sure you all know that Jean's son, Alan, started Sightline 30 years ago as of last week, November 2nd. So you must be there's a lot to be proud of. So welcome all of you to this conversation on how to help Cascadia thrive as our climate changes in our new wildfire reality. If you don't know what Sightline is and does, we are a sustainability think tank. We research the region's most pressing challenges. We're small, we're a 20-person organization, and we provide policy analysis and practical tools to citizens and decision makers to give them the information they need to make good choices on a sound environment, an economy, a livable way of life. So I'm actually a newbie to the world of wildfires. As you could tell, my background is mostly in agricultural economics and policy. But my family has contended with wildfires for decades. One second, there we go. On this map of the Northwest, the colors indicate the degree of wildfire risk, the amount of the percentage of properties in a zip code that are at high risk of encountering a wildfire. And this blue arrow points to where my mother lives in Montana, in the Cabinet Mountains, where the wildfire risk these days, today, is about 89%. So that means in these data, 89% of properties face a high wildfire risk every year. So it's one of the highest risk kind of places you can live. This blue arrow shows where my partner's family lives in North Idaho. It's only about 38% of properties face a high fire risk. However, we were evacuated when I was there this summer, the Athol fire. And as you can see, in 30 years, that risk is projected to grow to 82%. So things are changing. And this is where this arrow points to Colville, Washington, where my brother lives, and also home of the Vaughan Brothers lumber mill, where my brother works. These properties face about a 50% chance of fire these days, and that again will grow to 83% over the next 30 years. This is a photograph of the mill, And this is what they call the crane that delivers the mill from this vast log pile to the hew saw. And this mill is one of those that runs on a 24-hour cycle. So they have a day shift and a night shift. And as you can see, they need a lot of logs. And last year, my brother called me on the phone, and he was in a panic because about 180 acres were burning. And they had a deal with the Forest Service to purchase those logs, and that was what was going to keep the mill running throughout the winter. And so this was summer, and you could hear kind of the panic in his voice, but he really wanted me to hear. He put the phone up, and so I could hear the sound of the fire and just how harrowing and loud it was. And the thing is, I wish his timber hadn't been destroyed, but the forest was actually better off because of the fire. That forest, it's in one of these ponderosa pine, east side dry forests, and it evolved with wildfires every 5 to 20 years throughout the history. So these species, they developed, they evolved, they changed through evolution with fires. And so, oops, goodness, sorry. Getting a little, okay. So we actually need a lot more fire. Okay, just a quick raise of hands so I know the audience here. How many of you are aware of the fact that the West needs more fire rather than less? Kind of mixed a little bit. Yeah, good. So a lot of you kind of are already on board. That's great. Let's see. I'm going back and forth between a couple programs. So one thing that's unfortunate is that today the media describes fires, it describes the damage of fires based on how many acres were burned. And they describe catastrophic fires that because of all the acres that were burned. And so, for example, this Seattle Times headline says that the Gray Fire and the Oregon Road Fire of August burned near Medical Lake last summer. It destroyed 20,000 acres of fire. But were these acres destroyed? I mean, what did they look like after the fire? It turns out a lot of those acres were better off after the fire. Now, this is a serotinous pine cone. And serotinous pine cones only open up and let out their seeds when they get hot enough. And that's hard. It's hard to happen unless you had a fire heating them up. And so that's just kind of one example of forest adaptations that have evolved with fire and why forests need fire. Fires do become catastrophic, but it's when humans are in the way and houses and hospitals. So this is Jessie Montenay, and she lost her home in that Gray Fire, which burned near Medical Lake in August, and it burned about 240 homes around the town. And wildfires are now touching all of us. Some of us here today have been evacuated. I've been evacuated about 3 times, and all of us are breathing the smoke. And as most of you know, wildfires today are getting more frequent, and they're getting a lot bigger. A big fire in the past was about 400 acres. And if you don't deal with acres, that's about 300 football fields. So that was a big fire. And today, a big fire is more like 4,000 acres, or maybe 40,000 acres, or maybe 400,000 acres. In Canada this past summer, it was an anomaly, but it burned 45 million acres, which is roughly the size of Washington State. And they're still burning. So wildfires are good for land, but not all fires are good. So for example, some fires these days are burning so hot that they consume entire forests and they char the ground. And that kind of fire has existed throughout history. And it is important in some kind of outlier ecological evolution ways, but we're seeing a lot more of this super high severity fire, which in the short term, is very hard for a forest to recover from. Whoopsie. There we go again. Something that we're unfamiliar with today is that wildfires are becoming so severe that even the best firefighting resources in the world can't stop them. And so we've grown up over the past 100 years with this paradigm that we can stop a fire. And fires are changing. And partly this is kind of getting into the weeds here, but throughout the mid 20th century, our region was actually a lot cooler than it historically was and wetter. And so now we're getting kind of a rebound to historical conditions at the same time as we're getting climate change and a lot of what we call forest fuels, which I'll talk about in a second. Another thing that's new about fires today is, as we saw in Phoenix, Oregon, and Talent, Oregon, and in Lahaina, Hawaii, once a fire breaches a community, it can really spread like dominoes, where the ignition of one home, of each home, starts the ignition of its neighboring home. And it robs entire communities of their home. Like these folks from Detroit, Oregon, and the Santiam fire in Oregon in 2020, 1,500 structures were lost, 1,500 homes were lost. Another new thing about wildfires is that they're very expensive to fight. Today, wildfires are costing taxpayers about 20 times what they did just 30 years ago. So 20 times more money, the same amount of damage or more. Recently, a fire, 2 years ago, I think it was, $4.5 billion was spent fighting fires across the country on public lands. And as you all know, one of the major problems that we're dealing with fires, and a lot of people are scratching their heads trying to figure out, is how to deal with the smoke. Aside from the flames, wildfire smoke is irritating for everybody, it's deadly for some, and it's harmful to all of us. So all in all, the scientists that I've talked with all have the same message. If we're going to avoid a lot of misery, we really need a cultural shift. We can't play by the old rules anymore. We've essentially left the planet that we're familiar with, and we've touched down on an entirely different planet with different rules. And adapting to learning to live with wildfire is kind of the epitome of climate adaptation. We can't fight them anymore. We need to learn how to live with them. And there are no easy fixes, but there are important steps we can take if we want to thrive, even as our climate changes and wildfires continue. So moving on to kind of solutions, and how we can deal with this, I'll start with the obvious. The most important action we can take, a show of hands, or shout out, what's the most important action we can take to deal with the wildfire problem? What? Burn? Prescribe burn? Prescribe burn? How about no longer reducing our climate emissions? The first and most important thing is we need to reduce our climate emissions. Wildfire severity depends on temperature and moisture and fuel and oxygen. So this is a graph of temperature change over time. The orange line shows the difference between the temperature that year and the temperature average from 1901 through 1960. So this is kind of an anomaly graph. And the green and red areas show what scientists predict the temperature increase will be given. In the green area, if we can lower emissions, that's how much the temperature will increase. In the red area, if we can't lower emissions and we continue more as business as usual, we're going to see an extreme temperature increase, which will correlate with a lot more wildfire activity. So what the graph makes clear is that today's fires are really only a hint of what's to come. And this is terrifying, and I hate to stand up here and say these terrifying things, and this feels like so doomsday, but it's kind of surreal, right? We're living in a surreal time. But Jean Durning was talking about a book that recently came out at dinner, Fire Weather, and you can really kind of get a glimpse into the future when you read this book about what we're in for. So wildfires are already so damaging that, as you've read in the newspaper, the largest home insurers in California are no longer writing policies, and insurance companies in Washington and Oregon have also already canceled tens of thousands of policies. To get a sense of how warming affects wildfires today, let's look at the forest surrounding, again, my mom's house in Montana, which is the idyllic scene pictured here. So every degree of warming will increase the lightning activity around her house by 12%. And so more lightning, more fires. And on top of that, her fire season used to be from late June until early October, September, and it's now getting longer and longer every year, so more and more fires. Even without more lightning, if she's to maintain her current level of fire risk today, which is already 80% of the property's face fire risk, high fire risk, for every degree of warming, she would need to see also a 15% increase in precipitation to keep her risk the same. But every year instead, she's actually seeing her wells get drier and drier. So that's just kind of at a property level what we're looking at with the temperature changing. So what is the United States doing about it? What's Washington doing about it, Oregon? Unfortunately, we're suffering a little bit of wildfire climate myopia. Most of the fire professionals I talk with are thinking about this fire or maybe even next fire season, but they're not thinking too much beyond that. Policymakers, politicians, they're in general kind of reacting to the wildfire situation we're in. And insurers, they're only dropping coverage if you're uninsurable in 2023 or 2024. They're not dropping you if you're uninsurable in 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years. And so we're really just thinking about this moment, and we need to take a step back and like read John Valen's book, look at these predictions for 30 years and say, okay, what do we need to do now to prepare for that future? And luckily, at a place like Sightline, where I work, we have this incredible luxury to take the time to take a more holistic look and a long-term view of what's needed to help forests and communities thrive in the future. And it's clear to us that current wildfire policies need some drastic rethinking. Now, most attention these days, as you all I'm sure are aware, is focused on fire suppression, and definitely most dollars are going to putting fires out. Buying more aircraft, buying more bulldozers, remote sensing technology, increasing the firefighting workforce. Progressive solutions, like many of you mentioned, are focused on more fuels reduction, using prescribed burn and selective logging to thin out these fuels that that would otherwise make fires more severe and spread faster. But what Sightline's analysis shows is that there are actually two kinds of policy changes that are even more important. So second only, again, to drawing down greenhouse gases, the West's highest priority should be stemming the massive influx of ex-urban homes into fire-prone wildlands. I know that's easier said than done, but it's not impossible, and we have some really good ideas for how to do it. The problem is that people are moving out of cities and towns faster than ever before and into what's referred to as the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. Again, that's the wildland-urban interface, is where the wildlands intermix with homes or are near urban developments. And for example, like this new development, which is outside of Spokane, Washington. The WUI is growing faster than any other area in the United States, and people are building in the very footprint of recent wildfires. So if you look where wildfires have burned, the number of homes in those footprints has actually grown by over 60% in 20 years. So these places are essentially guaranteed to burn down without firefighting resources. So we're building where we know the homes are going to burn unless we spend these billions of dollars fighting fires. I'll tell you a story about one such footprint. This beautiful area to the west of Bend, Oregon, between the city of Bend and the Deschutes National Forest, it's always burned periodically, and it always will. This map shows Deschutes County's history of large wildfires over the past 100 years. And this one's circled I circled the Aubrey Hall fire, which burned in 1990 in Bend, kind of in the city, coming from the hills towards the city. And it burned with an incredible force and spread. And it forced the evacuation of hundreds of Bend residents. Within 10 hours, the fire had spread 6 miles. It jumped over 3 major roadways and the Deschutes River. And usually you think of these roads as a fire block. Definitely a river is kind of a fire block, but it bolted right through everything. The fire would have been catastrophic and burned much more of the city, but the wind shifted and blew the wildfire away from downtown to the huge relief of residents. And in the end, only about 22 homes were destroyed. But frequent fires don't seem to discourage people from building new houses. Just a few years after this Aubrey Hall fire, pictured on the far right here, the Broken Top community, it was built overlapping with the footprint of the fire. And the footprint of the fire is shown in red. So that was built, and then before too long, in 2009, a few years later, Deschutes County proposed expanding the city of Bend's urban growth boundary. So Oregon has a land use law similar to Washington State's, although more strict, and definitely kind of with more meat on the bones and details about how to use your land. And you have to apply to expand a city's urban growth boundary, and you can only expand if you really have no other options for population growth. So in 2009, Bend proposing expanding the urban growth boundary into the footprint of this fire by about 5,000 units. And here's a map of the proposed expansion. The area within the original boundary is shown in white, and the proposed expansion is shown in pink. Now remember, the whole area around, so here is where the Aubrey Hall fire kind of went through into here, but the whole area around the city is high fire risk. Luckily, there were a lot of people in Bend who are just like you, who care and concerned and take the time to do what's right, and they fought this proposed expansion. And they used Oregon's landmark land use law to appeal. They argued that the city hadn't considered existing opportunities for growth within the existing city boundaries. And now for some background, Bend had been expanding subdivision by subdivision for many years, over decades, and so when they were forced to look, they found a lot of room where they could grow inside the city limits. Now, they won. The appeal succeeded. And this map shows a much smaller footprint of the revised expansion. Of the original proposal, only the areas shown in purple were ultimately green-lighted for future development. Plus, shown in green, the city ended up upzoning areas, opportunity areas. So previously, these green areas were kind of single-family zoned, or a lot of that was vacant land or kind of commercial retail space. And it was upzoned to have multifamily up to 6 stories tall, and these new homes were built close to the river and to shops and to a promenade downtown Bend. So it was creating kind of a climate-smart city that we're seeing more and more of. And on the outskirts, the green is where they upzoned from single-family zoning to kind of duplexes and more multifamily construction. kind of proving that they had made the right decision by not expanding. Once a fire zone, always a fire zone. And this map shows the Two Bulls fire, which came through just actually while this controversy was going on. And it burned about 7,000 acres and it prompted the evacuation of about 635 homes. But if Bend had gone ahead with this expansion, 5,635 homes would have been evacuated. So there are three main ways to redirect growth away from the wildland-urban interface, away from rural areas, and back towards cities and towns. The Bend story shows the importance of Oregon's land use law, and Washington's land use law is also effective in this regard. It's just not quite as strict, so it's not quite as effective, but at protecting homes from wildfire. If California, for example, had a land use law like Oregon's, we would only see a fraction of the damage that wildfire is causing today. And Idaho and Montana can also take note. Even if statewide growth laws are politically unlikely in Montana or Idaho anytime soon, those states could do a lot to allow local jurisdictions to pass their own ordinances and to support growth management by local jurisdictions. Right now in Idaho, it's almost impossible for a local municipality to do anything in terms of growth management because because of the state constitution. So briefly, two additional kinds of tools for redirecting growth are eliminating perverse incentives that subsidize new development and thus incentivize growth in these wildland areas, such as, for example, government-backed mortgage guarantees, public infrastructure, and certain tax breaks. And we can stop shielding new homes from the full cost of wildfires, including, for example, free wildfire fighting, subsidized wildfire insurance, and post-fire hazard cleanup. So, for example, one way to stop shielding new homes from the full cost of wildfires, the Forest Service recently made a deal with the state of Idaho to shift some of the costs of wildfire fighting from the Forest Service to the state of Idaho. And what this does is it helps solve a moral hazard problem, because most states, it's the state that determines growth patterns, but it's the federal government that pays to protect these homes from wildfire. And so by shifting wildfire fighting costs onto the state, you're taking away some of that moral hazard. Over dinner, something came up in conversation that I just want to take a pause here and ask for some audience participation. So many of you have probably owned homes, and at tax season, the one thing that's good about tax season is you get this mortgage interest income tax deduction, which can be quite a lot, right? And so you can get it on your main house, you can get it on your second house, your third house, any number of homes. So how many of you would support an amendment to the federal tax code that only allowed you to take the mortgage interest tax deduction for one home? And if I'm just kind of curious. Okay, so there's a fair amount of support for that. And I just, I sit in my office and I have these ideas and I think, what would regular people think of this? I have no idea, so thank you for satisfying my curiosity. So, but it's things like that. It's things like that could help redirect growth towards cities, or reduce the amount of wildfire damage in the WUI, in the wildland-urban interface. And I'll get back into that in just a second. So redirecting growth is a complex problem. And Sightline's working with local jurisdictions across Cascadia to find solutions to manage growth. As I kind of get on my pulpit and say, we need to redirect growth towards cities, one thing that makes me sleep better at night is Sightline. Sightline, where I work, we have a housing program, and one thing we're doing is trying to make it easier to build in cities by upzoning, by kind of taking away, by removing single-family zoning and allowing more density and urban infill. So as as I go around to wildfire fighters and talk with policymakers, and I say we need to, redirect growth, as many of you know, cities aren't making it any easier to grow inside cities. And so another part of fighting, of dealing with the wildfire challenge is figuring out how to build more density in cities. As I say, Firefighter of the Year award goes to city infill. But until we do redirect growth, and even then, people will be building in fire-prone wildlands. And that brings me to the next most important strategy for adapting to wildfires after cutting greenhouse gases and redirecting growth. And that is fire-hardening homes. This photo shows homes that were destroyed by a wildfire, but trees surrounding the homes that lived through the fires. So most homes today were basically built to burn. Now this photo shows the opposite. It's a home that survived the intense Beachy Creek fire in Oregon in 2021 that burned so hot that it killed all of the surrounding forest, but the home survived. And the home survived because it was built with a fire-smart design, fire-resistant materials, and a fire-resistant landscaping. So this is a really important step we need to take to adapt to wildfires. And one argument against this kind of home hardening and defensible space. So home hardening is when you do things like put fire-resistant siding on. You replace a wood shake roof with an aluminum roof or even an asphalt roof. You have fire-resistant decking. You take your vents. In your attic, you have the attic vents and basement vents. And often they're just kind of these wood slats or something, or maybe they have 1/4-inch mesh screen. You want to replace that with 1/16-inch mesh, and there's a host of things you can do to harden your home against fires. And then the other term, defensible space, means taking out those really serotinous, those really high burning landscape shrubs and trees, and sadly removing some trees right near your house to prevent the fire from burning your home. And one argument against this kind of home hardening and defensible space is that it's just too much of a financial burden. But as this graph shows, the cost to build a fire-resistant home, as you can see in the right-hand column, for example, with that metal roof or the asphalt roof, non-combustible siding, etc., it costs about the same as building a conventional home. There's no difference. And in this particular analysis, the fire-hardened home actually cost a little bit less. But that is when fire resistance is part of the new construction. Now this graph, on the other hand, shows how much it costs to retrofit an existing home to meet wildfire safety standards. And that can get really expensive. In this case, for a medium-sized single-family home in Montana, it cost about $80,000 to retrofit to be wildfire resistant. So this is why wildfire building codes for new construction are so important. And nobody likes to be told what to do. But on the other hand, homeowners down the line, when the wildfires get really even more intense, they're not shouldered with this cost of retrofitting that really will be a big financial burden. And on this front, Washington and Oregon in 2022 and Washington this past legislative session, both states passed wildfire building codes. They're a little bit different. In Oregon, they're kind of tied to these wildfire risk maps. So if you're in a high-risk area, you need to fireproof your home if it's new construction. And in Washington, they just said if you live in the wildland-urban interface, you need to follow wildfire building codes. So now is the time to really tell these stories in Idaho, in Montana, and in British Columbia, and to really defend these laws from being repealed or diluted. And Washington's law is right now, as you can imagine, under some attack. I think it will probably survive, but it could use all of our support, honestly. So, so growth management and fire hardening homes, they're not what people typically think of when they think of adapting to wildfires and crucial wildfire policy. But our analysis suggests they are. What gets more airtime are efforts to return beneficial fire to the land, debates about what kind of restoration thinning to do, how to do prescribed burns, and that is also really important. In fact, a main reason why Sightline is advocating redirecting growth so strongly is because it's really hard to return beneficial fire to the land when there's homes peppered throughout the land. Now, this is a friend of mine in Montana sent me this photo. It's an overly dense forest stand in the Kootenai National Forest in Montana, and many forests today are overgrown and unhealthy. So you can basically think of them as they're sick forests, and what does the doctor order? The prescription the doctor writes is fire, and so that's why controlled burns are called prescribed burn. They're prescribed to make the forests healthy. So prescribed fire is when professionals carefully plan a burn, and planning a burn is this really intimidating process that you need a lot of skill to do, and these plans are very thick. You plan a burn, and then you get a lot of people out there, and you're very careful. You light it, control burn, and with the intention of nurturing the forest health and reducing fuels for wildfire. And one thing Sightline is working on right now is policy nudges that will actually make it a lot easier for public forests and tribes to do more prescribed burning, and also less wildfire suppression, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, just a caveat, if you're in the weeds here, you'll know, and I need to say it, it kind of speaks to this bigger issue, but not all forests need more fire. What a specific forest needs depends on its climate, its logging history, and a ton of other factors. It's way too complex to get into here, but in broad strokes, fire is usually less important in kind of more moist forests like the ones around here. And sometimes it's even counterindicated, for example, if you have a beautiful old growth forest in the Coast Range, for example. Now, forests started going downhill and becoming unhealthy and wildfire prone a lot longer ago than most people realize. It was actually before European, it started with smallpox. So before European smallpox and before guns and before manifest destiny, the Cascadia bioregion, the valleys and the forests and the plains were full of people. And from sea to mountain, they managed the landscape with fire. People, First Nations people, indigenous people used wildfire for so many different things. If they were going to have a gathering, they couldn't just get online or pick up their cell phone, they would start a fire. If they wanted to play lacrosse, they would burn the field, and so that nothing would stick up and poke you in the eye when you're like wrestling to the ground. If they had ceremonial dances, they would burn the dancing ground. I mean, so many things. And those are kind of the things that people don't normally think of. What's more common is understanding things like they would use fire to refresh huckleberry patches. That was a huge source of nutrition. And also to maintain camas fields, which is a root that made up a large part of native diets, more on the east side of the Cascades. Fire would also open up habitat for food animals, like elk, for example. So today, most of us are just learning how extensively indigenous people used fires and how populous the region was. For example, looking at just the Flathead Reservation, the tribes numbered between 20,000 and 60,000 people in the Flathead ancestral territories. And usually I name them, but when this, it's a little confusing because they're called the Salish tribes, but they're way over there in Montana. So the Salish sort of traveled along. So in the Flathead, you have the Salish, the Kootenai, and the Pend Oreille primarily. But by the time, so originally 20,000, 60,000 people. It's a big error, but we're not sure how many. But by the time Lewis and Clark arrived in around 1805, diseases had already ravaged through, leaving only about 2,000 to 8,000 people remaining. And with the plummeting population, the amount of fire started by people also plummeted. So you have indigenous population loss, but on the heels of that, on the heels of this population collapse, we got these state and federal laws banning fire and mandating that all fires be put out. It's called the 10 a.m. rule. It was the federal government's policy. And it was called that because whenever there's a fire, it had to be immediately attacked and suppressed by 10 a.m. and then put out by 10 a.m. the next morning. And California, that was in the early 1900s. California started this 50 years earlier, and a lot of Native people were killed for using fires, but definitely you had to put the fires out. So starting in the 1800s, in addition to the spectacular loss of indigenous fire, even these quote-unquote natural lightning-sparked fires were kept off the land. And if you look at tree rings and trunk transections, you can see when fires burned the trunk every year that this tree lived through a fire. And before the 10 a.m. rule, fire return intervals east of the Cascades were between every 5 years or 30 years. And the fire would come through and clean out all the small trees, clean out all the down debris, and other shrubs that would otherwise have built up and caused a typical small fire, a patchy fire, to become, when you have all these fuels, it becomes a large and severe fire. So today, most of these ecosystems in the West haven't seen fire for over 100 years, and consequently, we're now seeing these large and severe fires. So if you think back to earlier when we talked about climate change and how temperature is related to the frequency and severity of fires, well, all these fuels make that planetary warming just dramatically worse. So this is a graphic that I had our graphic artist design. And Sightline calls it the wildfire treadmill. So all of these fuels leaves us in a really impossible situation. We can think of it as a paradox, but I like the word treadmill because in order to restore forest health and reduce these forest fuels, we really need to get more beneficial fires sweeping through the land. But having snuffed out fire for over a century, we've suppressed ourselves into a corner where even a tiny little fire can just explode into a mega fire. And so we continue to fight all the fires, even though we know better. So it's a treadmill because the more we suppress fire, the worse fires get, and the worse fires get, the more we have to suppress them. The more we suppress them, the worse they get. Going on and on. So there are solutions, and we're getting there. And finally, there's mechanical thinning and prescribed fire are getting more legitimacy and federal funding and state funding. So over in the top right-hand corner, the machine you're seeing is called a masticator. And you can see them in your neighborhood sometimes, but they go and they cut off, they chew up trees and small, and I guess mostly just trees. They log the trees and then masticate them. And it creates chips that they spread along the forest floor. And those chips degrade fairly quickly, they decompose. So it's actually a higher fire risk at first, but then it becomes a low fire risk very quickly. And on the bottom right-hand slide is a feller buncher, and that's just kind of mechanically thinning trees so that there's less fuel when a fire comes through. Also, the remaining trees, grow much more vigorously, and they become more and more fire resistant because older trees are more fire resistant. for a number of reasons, but partly because their crown, the lowest branches, grow higher and higher. So some trees like cedars, they'll keep their crown to the ground, but many trees, they'll lose their lower limbs as they get older. And so thinning out the small ones lets the remaining ones get bigger, taller, and more fire resistant. And on the left here is a photo of a prescribed fire training. And you can tell it's a training because everyone's smiling and laughing. So real burns tend to be pretty stressful. There's a lot to get done. A lot can go wrong, and you typically have a very small window when it's not too hot, but it's hot enough to have a fire start. I was on a prescribed fire 2 weeks ago, and the word pig comes up, the probability of ignition. And you need the probability of ignition to be high enough that it lights, right? And ours at that time was about 30%, and it didn't end up lighting and going very far. We could light some things, but it didn't really meet the objectives. But you don't want your probability of ignition to be too high, so planning a prescribed burn is hard. So this is my friend Brad Donahue, and he is what they call a reserved treaty rights lands coordinator. He works for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he helps tribes manage the lands that they were unceded, but not part of their reservation. And you can tell he's not smiling because he's showing me a planned burn on his phone. And I met him at the Yakima Nation Fire Management Office to see if we could figure out how to make prescribed burns easier, and also how to make indigenous cultural burns easier, which I don't think I'll talk about tonight, but we'll see if we have time. And this is a photo of a burn plan that Brad just authorized. It's for a pretty small and easy burn, but like all burn plans, it's thick, and it specifies strict temperature, humidity, and wind conditions that must be met before a burn can proceed. You also have to have a lot of equipment nearby. You have to have manpower. You have to have dozers. There's a ton of requirements. And after the Calf Canyon fire, which most of you will know as the New Mexico fire that got out of hand, that prescribed burn that burned in New Mexico, now every burn on National Forest has to have the forest superintendent sign off on the burn every day of the burn. And so we're kind of getting more and more bureaucracy for prescribed burns. And Brad confirms this. Brad and a lot of other people I've talked with have said, yes, there's so much more social legitimacy for prescribed burns, and there's more funding for it, but it's actually not getting any easier to do them. And clearly, a warming climate is partly to blame for this. There are fewer and fewer days each year when the conditions are right for prescribed burn, when it's cool enough and wet enough. But another major obstacle, like we're talking about redirect growth, another major obstacle to prescribed burns is there are more and more homes in fire-prone wildlands, which makes it just too risky to set a fire. But there's more than that, and one thing Sightline's researching right now is just how we can change incentives, liability structure, gross negligence versus simple negligence, insurance for burners, a lot of human resources issues that could help make it easier to burn. There is some debate about just how much mechanical thinning and prescribed burning is really just a fool's errand. And there's so many vast forests, and prescribed burning is so expensive. Mechanical thinning is really expensive. And when you do a treatment, you need to go back and do it again and again. Every 20 years, say, you need to go back and burn again. And it's expensive. So given how much it costs, how much red tape there is, how much land needs to be burned, that's another question that Sightline is researching is, what's the end game here? Can we really use prescribed burn? And are there technologies that will tell us where and when this can actually be a viable solution? But it is a great idea. It's just, from a budget perspective, how are we going to make this work? So besides prescribed burn, So besides prescribed burn, Another tool we have in the toolbox is simply letting wildfires burn instead of immediately suppressing them. So this is Ron Swaney. He is the fire management officer for the Flathead Reservation. And I'm talking with a lot of native peoples, and I have a lot of photos because that's what I did this summer. Is I went around and visited reservations and ceded lands, and I talked with them about their burning. And so that's kind of my sources right now. So he and his team, so this is the incident command room where they were dealing with the Big Knife Fire in Montana. And he and his team were, well, what he's pointing to right now, the perimeter of the fire, and on the western boundary of the fire, the crews are working really hard to contain the fire and protect homes and protect infrastructure. But if you look closer, if you follow the fire to the east, you can see where it crosses into the tribe's cultural area, which on the map is marked by hash lines. In the wilderness, where the fire poses little risk, they were letting it burn. And by letting it burn, I don't mean they weren't doing anything. They weren't doing nothing. They were just not putting the fire out. What they were doing is monitoring the fire and staying prepared should the fire or the fire weather become more dangerous. So one way they were staying prepared is by protecting these bridges that are circled here. These are, bridges where you can get into the forest. And so they were using water and other kind of fire retardants to make sure that the bridges didn't go up in case they did need to get more aggressive about suppression. So that's kind of an example of what we call managing wildfire for resource benefit. When I first heard that that's what it's called, I thought, God, you guys need a better word for this. It's such a clunky term, right? What is a better word for not putting a fire out, managing wildfire? Because when I think of managing wildfire, I think they're fighting it, right? But in the jargon, managed wildfire for resource benefit means they're not putting it out because it can do a lot of good for the landscape. So I just want to be clear that this doesn't mean that many fires don't need full suppression. They do. Many fires do. And I'll illustrate this point with a recent experience I had when I visited the Nez Perce Fire Management Office in Idaho. During this trip, I stayed with my family in northern Idaho, several hours north of the reservation in Athol, which is near Coeur d'Alene. And I drove down, I visited the Nez Perce Fire Management Officer. And when I left to head back, well, first of all, it was about 4 p.m., and my car thermometer registered 112 degrees. And I think it was actually only 109. But in any case, when it's that hot, when it's triple-digit heat, fires just ignite with very little provocation. And so, hours north, and near Athol, as I would soon learn, at 3 p.m., the Athol fire, whoops, that's a little ahead of myself. The Athol fire started near Coeur d'Alene. And the whole town of Athol was evacuated, the highway was closed, and it looked like I would need another place to sleep that night. But the Athol, so I bring this up because I want you to know the Athol fire is the kind of fire you don't want to manage. You want to put it out as soon as you can because there's a lot of homes at stake and infrastructure. And I just want to say this because there's a lot of people who kind of want to let all the fires burn, and I think that's important to distinguish and understand that distinction. So the Athol fire is not the kind of fire anyone wants to manage. And it was snuffed out within hours by this aircraft and lots of other resources. And in the end, it only burned about 60 acres. But nearby, this is the Ridge Creek fire, you can see. So Athol is up there in yellow, and then the Ridge Creek fire is down a little bit. The Ridge Creek fire, real close by, in that area, the Panhandle National Forest, Coeur d'Alene National Forest, they're actually very progressive, and they were letting this fire burn because the wind was pushing it away from the town, and it wasn't really risking anything right then. It was heading away from populated areas into wildlands. Now, this isn't something that you see all that often, but hopefully we'll see more and more of this in the future where you use managed wildfire to benefit forests. So, let's see. I'll just wrap up in a little bit and leave time for Q&A. So I'll go and kind of, I'll wrap up for a second. So we've only scratched the surface, but I do want to leave enough time for vibrant discussion. You have so much wisdom and experience in this room, and I know there's someone in here who's writing a book about wildfires and whether the forests of the world are becoming more sinks or sources, no pressure, but lots of you, all of you have very interesting things to say, so I want to have a good discussion. But to connect the dots, I'd like to recap the main reasons why redirecting growth towards existing cities and towns should be our first priority. That is, alongside saving homes and reducing climate emissions. So first of all, on average, rural living emits more greenhouse gases per person. Second, more exurban homes means more wildfires and more wildfire damage and suffering. Most wildfires are caused by people. Like the vast majority of wildfires are caused by people. I think 80% of wildfires are caused by people, and 95% of wildfires that damage structures are caused by people. And something I didn't talk about, but as effective as it is to create this defensible space around your house to prevent it from being consumed in a wildfire, that means removing your photosynthesizing, shade-providing bird habitat trees. And so it's better for the birds if you build homes in town. Fourth, many of these homes will soon be uninsurable. They have insurance when they're built, and they have insurance when they're bought, but for how much longer? And that's not just an individual homeowner's problem. That means either a spreading economic slump, and when this becomes real hot, or a huge taxpayer insurance subsidies, or both. Fifth, for every exurban home, suppression costs, which are already more than we can really afford at $4.5 billion per year, will get even more expensive. And finally, building homes near wildlands keeps us trapped on this wildfire treadmill. When houses are nearby, prescribed burns become dangerous and expensive, if not impossible, and managed wildfire for resource benefits taken off the table. Homes nearby also ratchets up air quality thresholds, which further limits when burns are possible. So more exurban homes means more forest fuels and more fire risk for everybody. So it's a tough conversation to have with people. Most of my immediate family, as you saw, lives in the wildland-urban interface. And so how can we tell people looking to have that dream that they can't build there now? So it's ironic, but in the short term, it's actually insurance companies may be our best bet for redirecting growth. They have some of the best data, and they're telling people it's too dangerous to build there. We can choose to listen. Instead of asking, how can we get insurance for new developments in high-risk areas, we could ask, where will homes be uninsurable in 50 years? So here's the climate graph again. Insurers are only telling us where it's too dangerous to build now on that orange line. They're not telling us about where it's going to be uninsurable in the red or the green. But plenty of scientists have good predictions about where new houses will be uninsurable once we hit the green or the red areas. And with that, I want to say thank you for your attention and for your interest in this topic, and I can't wait to hear your questions and even some of those statements that are disguised as questions.
Okay, questions. There are microphones in all sections. Ina, start.
One aspect that you did not touch and that impacts people tremendously is the air. What happens, how can that be ameliorated? How can society, not society, just humans, and as well as animals, be saved? Because we're not going to survive with this kind of air.
Yeah. Yeah, so smoke is a new problem, or so it would seem. Historically, pre-European, there was about this much smoke because fires came frequently. And so it's really, we're here where smoke has always been. And we had this anomalous century where smoke was excluded. So now we can't exclude it anymore because wildfires are too severe. And now we're trying to put more prescribed fire on the land. So, what are we going to do? And I think, and Alan, the executive director of Sightline, is very sensitive to this issue because he knows how painful it is for people. So I'll share with you what some of the people I'm talking with are saying. And there are definitely ways that individual households can adapt through MERV filters in their houses. And that's kind of where we're going. That's the best idea that people have is we need to really insulate our envelope of our home to protect our air quality in the inside and kind of create these cultural norms. Putting fire back on the land through prescribed fires does create smoke. And that is a problem. And burners, prescribed fire practitioners are really aware and sensitive about this. And they choose their days to burn based on, what was it the other day? There was, community events, if there's going to be a pancake breakfast, they definitely won't burn. Or I forget what it was last week. So oftentimes they'll have these big burn plans and they just can't do it because there's a big community event. But I will channel Bill Tripp. Bill Tripp is a Karuk native who is one of the kind of pioneers in cultural burns and getting cultural burns back onto the land. And he says, we really need to understand our relationship with smoke, because smoke has a lot of benefits. And one of which is it's cooling. So the native people would often use smoke to actually cool salmon streams. So this is a long way of saying there's no answer for smoke. We're going to have to live with smoke. It's going to be something that public health departments work with community infrastructure and work with individual residents to make their homes and their lifestyles more smoke resistant. Yeah. But I do want to take this opportunity to say that not all smoke is created equal, and smoke from wildfire and smoke from structure fires is much more damaging than smoke from prescribed burns. Structural fires, you get a lot of toxics in your smoke. When wildfires, you get a lot of particulate matter, which is terrible for your lungs, but it doesn't come with as much toxics. And with prescribed fires, you get fire, but it's a lot less, it's a lot cute, so it is safer. And what I say is a fire in time saves 9, like a stitch in time saves 9, right? A fire in time. So if you put a little bit of prescribed fire on, then you will be eventually reducing the amount of really big smoke from wildfires.
You said something over here. Some things that we can do with homes to fight against the smoke itself. But I couldn't catch the words. Could you repeat what you said? You remember?
Yes, yeah, sure. I can repeat. I'm definitely not an expert in home air quality. But when you close gaps in your house, do anything kind of in a very cold climate when you insulate your house, all of that kind of insulation can help keep the outside air outside. Okay. And you installing HEPA filters, and just that kind of basic clean air filtration systems. Okay. Yeah, someone in here I'm sure knows more than me about how to improve a building's air filtration system.
Kate, it was a great coverage of this very complex topic. It's no.
You do have to speak right into it, I've
Okay,
learned.
does that do it?
Yeah.
Right. So it sounds like the most effective motivational tool we have at Sightline I want to push are the uninsurability maps for these wildland areas. I mean, people really have to stare at that before they plunk their money down. That might be highly motivating.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, yeah. Put those on billboards. One thing I suggested in an article is, and having that as part of the realtor description. You've probably seen, it's a pretty standard form. How many rooms do you have? How much square footage? How old is the roof? And there should be a slot for what is your wildfire risk now, and what's the wildfire risk in 50 years? Yeah. And California is actually starting to play with laws mandating that kind of. They already have a law that mandates that kind of disclosure, but you can kind of put it in the fine print. And if you've ever bought a house, like at the last minute, you have all these fine prints, and you're like, oh my gosh! And so it's that kind of thing, and you've already basically committed. So they're trying to create more robust processes for that. I think that's a great idea.
I'm having, yes, I'm not having trouble. What about revising codes, building codes, to require some of the mechanisms that you mentioned to make houses more fireproof? I mean, there are already houses out in areas, that are threatened. And what about changing the codes so that there need to be changes in the houses that exist in, threatened places already? Is there any movement towards that?
I haven't heard of anyone trying to do that. Not in Washington and Oregon. It's all for new construction or improvements. In 2008, California passed a law that was the first wildfire building code, and it was actually just a fire building. It was after the Oakland fires. But I don't know for sure if that was only for new construction. I thought it would be a very hard sell because it would cost a lot of money. But what jurisdictions are doing in pilot projects here and there is that they are using public funds to support really high-risk towns. And there's a few of those. FEMA is supporting that kind of program, and there's a few of those in California, and they're working very well. And it doesn't always cost $80,000. A lot of these things you can do with a trip to the hardware store and $50. A mesh screen, just landscaping yourself, caulking joints where embers can come in. Is what will really burn down a house is less the flames and more the embers getting inside, the embers getting through a vent or getting through a kind of little hole, or an ember landing on a wood roof, maybe where some pine needles have gathered. And then the house, the flames themselves, unless it's like a Fort McMurray type of situation, are often less the cause than embers.
Hello. Some of us have places next to Forest Service lands, U.S. Forest Service land. What should be our reasonable expectation for what the Forest Service does to keep these lands free of wildfire?
What should be your reasonable expectation? Well, it's tough. I hear more and more. This is kind of a different topic, and I'm a little bit hesitant to wade in, but one thing I hear about, I'll just throw this out there, is a lot of conservation groups are actually trying to prevent thinning and fuels reduction. And it's a really tough situation because the Forest Service was founded in the early 1900s, and it was founded by Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, but then it also had these other congressmen who didn't want anything, did not think any private land should be, any land should be owned by the government. And so said, we're only going to let the Forest Service exist if it's basically a wildfire fighting service, and it keeps all this merchantable land. And so from the very beginning, the Forest Service has these dual mandates. And so it's tough. And so you bring that up to the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and you have the Forest Service logging old growth trees, you have the timber wars in Oregon, and you have a lot of economic pressure on the Forest Service saying, take out trees, make money. I'm a mill, I want you to make money. And so forest restoration means logging the forest to thin the forest and make it healthy again, and that's real. But how do you know what is irresponsible, profit-only logging, and what is restoration logging? I mean, if you're a forester and you're in the forest, you know it, but it's hard to know. And so there's a lot of lawsuits preventing some of these thinning and burning. And if I had more time, I'd really like to look into that and kind of figure out if there's a way we can be more clear about that. But what you can expect your forest to do, you can talk to your local forest and tell them that you want them to use something called PODS, P-O-D-S. I forget what it stands for, but it means using technology to figure out where exactly on the land, based on topography and fuels and climate and weather patterns, where you really need to do some prescribed burn. But get involved. If you lived in Montana, I know that the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation helps private landowners on their land. But yeah, I don't know what you can expect. I think you can expect, it really depends on the forest supervisor. And I hope that wasn't too rambling of an answer, but the Forest Service is, it's interesting.
I am wondering if there are certain trees that are more susceptible to either easily being burnt or more resistant to fires.
Yes.
There's so many alder, for instance, in the area, and the alders are, the golden leaves are just beautiful. But I think they are shorter lived in the first place and more easily burned.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. For example, you have the beautiful sequoias and the beautiful redwoods. And the sequoias were, evolved to be fire resistant. And the redwoods evolved to burn up, but then to quickly send out new shoots. And so, I think black spruce are some of the most incendiary fire trees that are most likely to burn. And ponderosa pine are less likely to burn. Yeah, every tree has its own probability of ignition, I guess. But on that note, just another quick little interesting aside, not just the trees, but how they're planted. And there's in Oregon, I'm not sure if you're aware, but if you look at a map in Oregon, you can see this checkerboard, because when the railroad existed, there was this checkerboard of land rights, and they gave those partly to the state and partly to private timber companies. And so it creates this amazing natural experiment, because normally you can't say, okay, I'm going to put a clear cut here and a state managed multi-age forest over here. But because of this natural experiment, you have this checkerboard, a wildfire came through there, and you can really look at what kind of management has what kind of effects. And it's very clear that clear cuts, typically you have dug for a clear cut and grown on a 40-year rotation. And those landscapes burned much more severe, much hotter, and they spread faster than the state lands, which were kind of what they do on state lands is they selectively log, so you have different ages, different species, and those were more fire resistant. So it's similar. It's a little bit about species, but also about how they're planted.
I have friends who own property in Montana.
Lucky you.
It's not me. But they have one of the things that generally they're coping with in that part of the state, which is the western part, is the invasive beetles. and various other insects that are making the trees more vulnerable, and the various properties more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yes. Okay. So last week I went to the University of Montana Experimental Forest, Lubrecht, and I toured this forest, and we got snowed on, so it was quite a day. It was like this experiment blew my mind. I loved it, and we got snow. It was gorgeous. But they planted 4 experimental plots, and the first was a control plot. They didn't do any. They didn't plant. They managed. So they didn't do anything in the first plot. In the second plot, they thinned the trees. That's it. And in the third plot, they thinned and burned the trees. And in the fourth plot, they just burned. So these 4 different management styles. And so when I went last week, it was 20 years later. So I got to see the kind of longish, kind of short-term results. In forest time, that was a short term. But it was really interesting. Unplanned, they had a beetle infestation. And what happened? Any ideas? Which forest survived the beetle better? Okay, who thinks the thin-only forest survived the beetle attack the best? How about the thin and burn? Okay, I got a lot. So, yeah, the thin and burn and the thin survived the beetle attack a lot, with a lot less mortality. The control with no management, that was decimated. And the burn only was also had more mortality. So thin and burn was best, and thin only actually worked the best. And they're not quite sure, but it's a small sample size. But yeah, so there you go. So I think forest management is really important for beetles. Yeah, and one reason why is because when you thin, all of a sudden these trees can grow. They have more water, they have more sunlight, more nutrients, and when they grow, they develop these sap nodules. So these sap nodules go kind of vertically and horizontally throughout the trunk, and each one of these is like a force field against a beetle. And so when you thin, you create a lot more sap, and you help the tree protect itself.
Thank you all very much. I don't know who said the editorial in, I think it was today's paper, maybe yesterday's paper, about wildfire in our Washington state lands. Anybody can come up and talk to Kate briefly this evening. And thank you very much, as well as thank you, Kate, so much.
Thank you. Thank you.